please share the information provided in this video. Always remember that a crucial part of removing a person's confusion is understanding his or her own unique source of it. What is the purpose of presuppositional apologetics? Basically, presuppositional apologetics exists for the Christian to continue to be a Christian, because that's how the Christian grew up and how the Christian has decided to be. It is not really much of a method of convincing anyone else to be a Christian. Rather, it is a method of, I'm smart and I don't have to listen to you. How does the presuppositional apologist define faculties? The word faculties is a very important word in presuppositional apologetics, and basically it means your five senses and your mind. So your sight, your hearing, your smell, your touch. Is that it? Yeah. Alright, then sight, smell, hearing, touch, taste. Yeah, that's the other one. And then your mental abilities too. And it becomes very important to understand, especially central is the mental one. What is the presuppositional apologist concept of no middle ground? This is important to understanding the basic idea behind presuppositional apologetics as opposed to classical apologetics. In presuppositional apologetics, no middle ground is the idea that everyone has presupposed a belief system, and that life is just essentially based on assumptions. No one, in essence, it is the idea that no one ever knows anything for sure, and to live life, everyone has to make assumptions or presuppose things, and that everybody, as they go through life, has already presupposed or assumed something without proof. In other words, the presuppositional apologist's basic idea is that there is no common area of debate. There is no such thing. That they believe that everybody has already made up their mind and has already assumed something, and they've assumed the assumptions may be in total contrast or difference to one another, and that's basically the idea that you can't really know anything for sure, but to go through life you have to assume things. You've heard this before, the idea that you can't know anything for sure. I'm sure people have argued that there's no such thing as truth, or that nothing is certain. But the presuppositional apologist is going to put a different spin on it. They have their own unique way of sort of breaking out of that. They say, okay, I can't trust my faculties, but if God exists, I can. Therefore, God exists, and I can trust my faculties. That is, in a nutshell, presuppositional apologetics. I'll say it again. I can't trust my faculties if God doesn't exist. If God does exist, I can trust my faculties. Therefore, God exists. Now, the obvious question to this is, how do you know you can trust? How do you know any of that? Like, how do you know that you can't trust your faculties if God doesn't exist, and that if God exists, that you can? But the conversations that you have are not going to be as simple as that. And I tried to come up with, some sort of sample conversations. So let's get into, how does a conversation with a presuppositional apologist go? Okay, so after some introductory back and forth, they kind of get things on the topic of what they want to talk about. We'll get to the meat of presuppositional apologetics. And basically, here we go. The presuppositionalist will say, man cannot trust his faculties, but if the biblical God exists, man can trust his faculties. Now, we're going to assume the responder is an atheist. So the atheist will say, but how do you know this God exists? The presuppositionalist will say, by asking that question, you are assuming that you can trust your faculties, but you cannot, you can be wrong. And the atheist will respond, aren't you making the same assumption? The presuppositionalist will say, no, I believe in the God of the Bible, so I can trust my faculties. You are an atheist, so you cannot trust yours. So the problem is that the presuppositionalist is in essence begging the question, or it's more of a bare assertion. I don't know if you could give it the full title of question beg. It's more just, I'm right because I'm right, and I'm right. Did you know I was right? But if you question that, they're going to, you know, just raise doubt about what you have to say. And then if you try to explain how the doubts are unfounded, they'll just raise more doubt about what you have to say and just be more sure that they're right. So what is the right way to handle a conversation with a presuppositional apologist? My best advice is to keep asking questions. Don't make statements. Don't make assumptions. Don't include information in your questions. Just ask questions. Just keep questioning things. So let's look at a sample conversation I tried to come up with. After the usual back and forth, we get to the meat of presuppositional apologetics. Man cannot trust his faculties, but if the biblical God exists, man can trust his faculties. How do you know this to be true? And there's a lot in that. Okay, so the atheist says, how do you know this to be true? Now the issue is that there's a lot to this. So you could be more specific, but I'll stick with general, how do you know this to be true? The presuppositionalist says, by asking that question, you are assuming that you can trust your faculties. But you cannot, he may add in something, because you're an atheist. And he'll say, you can be wrong. You don't have a God to make you sure you're right. Okay, then the atheist can respond and says, how do you know that by asking that question, I am assuming that I can trust my faculties? Okay? This is the flaw of presuppositional apologetics. It's a self-contradictory idea. They say that they can't know anything for sure, but then to know that, they have to know something for sure, you know. And if they want to get out of that by saying that they can trust God, then at that point they're begging the question, because how do you know you can trust God? But the best way I can see to reveal it is to just ask very simple, straightforward questions. So again, how do you know that by asking that question, I am assuming that I can trust my faculties? Okay? So what's he going to say at that point? Because in essence, presuppositional apologetics doesn't reference God to say that there's no middle ground. And that's the issue. They reference God to, you know, to say that they've gotten away from the non-existent middle ground. But to say that there's no middle ground, they don't really reference God for that. If they want to reference God for that, you can just keep questioning that. Because begging the question is essentially a logical fallacy of asking you not to ask certain questions. And so it's kind of a two-headed snake. They may go the route of, well, you can't know that you even have the ability to reason to ask a question rationally, and you can just ask. You can ask them, well, how do you know that I don't have the ability to reason? You know, and they're going to see the logical contradiction in that idea by saying that man doesn't have the ability to reason, and then, you know, they have to reason to know that. Or if they want to go the route of saying, I have the ability to reason because God, you know, helps me, you can just keep questioning that, you know. So anyway, because I believe in the God of the Bible, so I can trust my faculties. You're an atheist, so you cannot trust yours. All right, and then you can just keep going. Like the atheist could say, and how do you know this belief means you can trust your faculties? All right. Now, will the conversation always go this way? They have multiple ways of saying the same thing. So they could say something like, what is your basis of reasoning that God doesn't exist when God is the basis of the universe, and that kind of thing, you know. But it's basically the same thing. Now, you could, in theory, proclaim some other God, and you could, like, pretend to be what they are, but for Zeus or Thor or something, or, you know, Krishna, whoever, and you could say that you trust your faculties because of some other God. And presuppositional apologetics is basically set up against atheism. And if you bring in some other God, what they're going to do is just argue against that God. And they kind of bring in this idea of, we're going to argue against every God, and then by process of elimination, we'll wind up with the biblical God. It's kind of their thing. So that may not be as productive of a route, and not as necessarily true to your atheism. And the final question is, you know, can we trust our faculties? And this is something you hear a lot. You know, people say, nothing is certain, or there's no such thing as truth. And when it comes to questions like that, typically you can respond by showing the inherent contradiction in that it violates the second principle of reason, the law of non-contradiction. And the law of non-contradiction is basically a thing is not what it is not. And the law of identity, which comes right before it, is the thing is what it is. Now, when you say, you know, we can't trust facts, there are no facts, we can't know anything for sure, you could ask someone, well, are you sure? Because implied in that, when they say we can't know anything for sure, then they're also saying, I'm sure that I don't know anything for sure. I know this for sure, that I don't know anything for sure. So they're contradicting themselves. Now, that is a self-destructive, self-contradictory idea. Sometimes people will say that if you point out the contradiction in their logic, you're being circular in your reasoning and begging the question. But the problem is that the law of non-contradiction is not something that's circularly affirmed like presuppositional apologetics is. Rather, the denial of the law of non-contradiction is circularly destructive. It destroys itself because it affirms what it denies. It's a snake that eats itself. And it's very different from the idea of, you know, a man pulling himself up by his own bootstraps. That's fundamentally different. Usually circular reasoning arises when someone has not encountered ever, or almost never, anyone who doesn't believe in the whatever it is they believe. And so they've lived within a bubble or a monastery or some type of system where there was no questioning of this. And so when you question it, they beg the question. And begging the question is just a fallacy of asking you not to ask certain questions. So the fundamental flaw of presuppositional apologetics is two-headed. In essence, what they're going to say is you can't trust your ability to reason. And the problem is that they have to be able to trust their ability to reason to know that. Now they try to get out of it by saying, well, if God exists, then I can trust my ability to reason. And then you could say, well, how do you know this God exists? But then by asking that question, you're trusting your ability to reason. So in essence, they can shift gears. So when you want to argue with someone, you have to lay tracks, A to B to C, see the connections. This infers this, deduces this. And what they can do is, at any point in the conversation, shift to a completely different basis for what they believe. They can start with a basis of, we don't know anything for sure, and therefore you don't know anything, and I don't know anything, and I'm going to assume I'm right. Or they can start with a basis of, I'm assuming I'm right because God exists, and because God exists, I can know that I can trust my mind. You know, so they can either beg the question or make this self-defeating, you know, idea. So their fatal flaw is either violation of the second law of logic, the law of non-contradiction, or a simple question beg, where it's just a fancy way of assuming you're right. But the best response, the interesting thing, and this, you know, I'm a Christian, I believe in God, and I feel like God's smiling when the response to a self-contradictory idea or a question beg is to just ask questions. That is the best counter-apologetic. And know that classical Christian apologetics, the Christian apologetics that have been done over the centuries, is not presuppositional apologetics. It's like 50 years old or something like that. You could look it up. But classical classical apologetics, Aquinas, you know, C.S. Lewis, Anselm, even going back to Aristotle on some levels. This is, and I mean, it's biblical. The Bible says that the creation proves the Creator in Romans 1. So that's how classically apologists have approached this. But anyway, thanks for listening. New videos every Monday and Friday, sometimes some in between. Subscribe for more.